That's a bit better. Good morning. I'm so pleased to be here. This is one of my favorite Neutra buildings, and I can't express my gratitude enough to Pastor Mark. I just had a brief interlude with your wonderful narrative, and I think Richard Neutra would just applaud the entire thesis because it starts with the off-centeredness of life itself and existence and pain and chaos. And there is something about what psychologists call dynamic symmetry or balanced asymmetry that is very much expressed in this environment. I'm going to continue Pastor Mark's religious theme um, by talking about the very first passage that Bible passage that was read on January 3rd, 1960, the day that the very first time that this wonderful congregation were able to worship in their new sanctuary. Pierce Johnson, who appears to be quite the rebel, he preached a sermon called Survival Through Design based on Psalm 118, verse 5. Now, Survival Through Design, as you know, is Neutra's very famous 1954 book, arguing that architecture could save the universe, basically. The verse is, I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. What is 20th century architecture but an expression of freedom of space? That is the big material for the 20th century, right? Space itself. Oops, no. Okay, and at the risk of boring people who have heard me a million times, I just wanted to express a couple of points about Richard Neutra's background and his basis in evolutionary biology, physiological psychology, Gestalt aesthetics, and even a bit of Freudian psychology. But he also believed that our genesis as human beings was the savannas of East Africa. And so the opportunity to be harnessed and linked and synthesized with nature itself was absolutely important to the human organism if it was going to thrive. These are savannas of the East Africa. If you look at Neutra's drawings, you will always see his trees expressed very similarly to the acacia tree, which is considered the world's oldest tree. So this is our African Genesis. This is a book and an author that he held dear, Robert Ardrey. And as you can see, Neutra believed in no boundaries between you and space and nature. This is the Wrench House in Switzerland with a 400-foot drop-off there. So don't go too far. I asked Mrs. Wrench once whether any of the children, any incidents that ever happened, like a death of a child, and she said no. She said people just had to be told. People are responsible. People know there's an edge, and that was the end of it. She sounded almost insulted by the question. Very American question, I might add. The other anchor in Neutra's practice, his theory, his philosophical basis, was Wilhelm Wundt, who is considered one of the founders of physiological psychology. Now, Wundt established the idea that you could quantify the impact of the environment on an organism. If you can quantify that, then you know how to manipulate it, which is astounding news for an architect, right? Who wants to create an environment that is resonant, makes you thrive, nourishes you. And this is this is his principal book. He actually was the author of 450 books, missives, articles, pamphlets. Nobody's ever read them all, not even his biggest proteges. Now, on your right, there's the chapter heading the bodily substrate of the mental life. So we have this integration that was so vital to Neutra, so important, this synthesis, this integration of body and mind. He rejected the Platonic ideal of that deep divide, and argued for what is now called structural coupling, in which the organism is linked to the environment. Now, this is where Neutra grew up. These are some churches in central Vienna in the Habsburg Empire, quite a bit different than Claremont United Methodist Church. I'm going to go right now to Garden Grove, just to talk briefly, to compare, contrast a very extroverted church with this more introverted church. As you can see from the plan, oopsie, how do I go forward? There we go. No, there. As you can tell from the sanctuary here, where many of you have already visited, you have a long strip of water, and you have an extraordinary access to the outdoors in this very extroverted worship environment. You can see that it's transparent. It's almost a floating pavilion of glass that's open to the landscape. And of course, it's made famous by Reverend Schuler's very famous balcony, where he could preach to the inhabitants of 600 parked cars. There you see the relationship to the outdoors on the east facade. Now, by contrast, this is a relatively enclosed worship environment. It much more responds to the historical condition of churches, which are naves, which are the cities of God, that are a place to be sacred and away from the world. This is one of Neutra's first sketches for the church, with this rather exuberant welcome, but incredibly simple and cost-effective construction. And here's another sketch of the interior. And just as Pastor Mark's narrative in the brochure teaches us, shows you, everything is off-center. There's almost a complete expression of what we would call Gestalt aesthetics, in which you have forms projecting and receding, dark contrasting with light. So that's an incredibly vibrant, kinetic, organically alive interior. This is a Julius Schulman photograph on the right from the Getty, and a more contemporary photograph, on the left and on the right. I also want to bring your attention to a very important part of the church, which is the idea of the diagonal. In classic Beaux-Arts architecture, you have what's called kind of a full frontal expression of a facade. So everything is kind of very perpendicular, right across from. But in modernism, you have a very different idea happening. You have an idea of the diagonal, where everything is happening according to motion, right? If you're living on the diagonal, so to speak, you are engaged in movement. And the whole idea of movement, that each elevation is going to be different, was very much a primary tenet of modernism. So here you have two directions of visual access to the landscape, to Mount Baldy beyond. You have the very straight on that is that you can see from the once again, as Pastor Mark indicated, the asymmetrically located aisles, and then you have another diagonal access from the other corner of the sanctuary. And here you have this asymmetrical expression of opposite colors, of opposite ways to experience nature. And what I find utterly brilliant about this particular the ground level clear story, if you will, is that it also responds to two other Bible verses, and they're also both from the Psalms. And one is Psalm 119, 105. Oh, don't do that. I don't want to join cable Wi-Fi. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Well, there you have it right there. Daylighting right there. And then Psalm 121, verse 1, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence makes me cry, from whence cometh my help. So these are the kind of Bible verses that are informing Neutra, informing the very architecture and spatial design of the church. Of course, one can easily argue that the canted walls provide acoustic vibrance, right? No dead spaces with canted walls. But you see this incredible use of the keel of a ship, which Pierce Johnson and the congregation was so taken with. You have that keel of the ship going right out into the space. I asked Reverend Johnson once. I was so fortunate to interview him. Did you ever feel conflicted? I mean, lots of people who love nature don't exactly go to church. And in fact, people argue that spirituality, my nature is my spirituality, blah, blah, blah. But Pierce kind of answered me very gently and gravely. And he said, whatever keeps people awake is a good thing. Number one. And number two, nature is God and God is nature. So of course I don't have a problem with this. There used to be a bird perch right on beyond, and I hope one day the church makes that part of its restoration to restore that bird perch out there. But that certainly was Mr. Reverend Johnson's way of addressing that apparent. I thought it was going to be a very difficult, interesting question, but it wasn't. I also wanted to finish up with another church that Neutra designed and was completed the same year, and that's the Miramar Naval Air Station, which I think also brings in so many contrasts, but almost in a very jagged way. The contrasts are abrupt and not as synthesized, and which, as I find here in this church. The asymmetry of the aisles are there. The keel of the church is there. Asymmetry is there. But it just doesn't, to me, have the poetical resonance that is very much present and alive in this church. Thanks so much.